Welcome to the Clause YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Clause YouTube channel Strategic Frontlines. And today we are privileged to have with us a very special guest, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya. He was our former secretary and former ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, and Switzerland. Currently, he is the professor of diplomatic practice at Jindal. I welcome you, Ambassador Bhattacharya, to this show.
Thank you very much, Roshan. I'm delighted to be here back at Clause again.
Thank you so much. Today, we will unravel the Turkey-Pakistan Tango and what leverages India has. But before we start that, we would try to see Turkey's global aspiration. Because in spite being in traditional alliances with the US and Europe, it's forging new partnerships and blocs with countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, Central Asia. So I would like to ask Ambassador Bhattacharya first is, does Turkey look for strategic autonomy? Because on one hand, its relationship with US under Trump has of late improved. Whereas if we try to see its relationship with Russia, Ukraine, during the Russia-Ukraine war, Turkey supplied drones to Ukraine, but also engaged diplomatically and economically with Russia. In China, with China, it has economic partnership, and China is its largest trading partner. So in your view, how is Turkey maneuvering all these angles, and what is its ultimate goal? Your views.
Sure, Roshan. I think it's so important to understand Turkey from its historical as well as its present context, because Turkey as a country has existed for about 1,000 years. The Turks have been there for about that long, and therefore there's a lot of history that goes into the way a Turk thinks today. But I think if you look at modern times, particularly in the post-war scenario, what we do see is that Turkey actually sought to become a Western power. And that was a drive that Ataturk had made. And after the war, they sought to become a member of the NATO, which they did. And subsequently, when the European Union was formed, they actually applied for membership of the European Union. And Turkey continued to grow because it became a very formidable economic and a military power as well. So while it continued its NATO alliance, and it is in fact the second largest military within NATO perhaps, its association with Europe never really took off in the manner that Turkey had hoped. And therefore, in a sense, it was rebuffed by Europeans. And so by the time Erdogan comes in a little more than 20 years ago, what we do find is a certain reconfiguration. And you do see that in the early days, he's pushing for economic growth and social development, and very successfully at that. But he finds that his rise as a middle power is not fully accepted and acknowledged by the West. And that's what brings in this new idea that Erdogan now espouses. He says the world is greater than five. In other words, he says that the 5 permanent members are not the only ones who should be deciding what is going to happen in the world. He also says Turkey is a middle power. And he says as a middle power, Turkey needs more leverage, more space, and it should have the right to decide on its own. So it's a little different from the way we see strategic autonomy, but Turkey wishes to have more space. And that's why you see Turkey having its diplomatic adventurism in various parts of the world, in the neighborhood, and in far-flung regions, even in, say, Central Asia or in Africa, where Turkey is very active diplomatically. So within this construct, what you see, there are these ups and downs, and forging of new alliances. I see the current phase of Erdogan broadly building down into two strategic thrusts that he wishes to achieve. One is, in order to achieve the greatness that Turkey should have, as he believes it, there is a certain sense of revival of the Ottoman glory and the great sense of empire that was there. And I think that leads to a lot of diplomatic adventurism. The second thing that happens is that, and notice that Turkey does not have very good relations with its Arab neighbors. In fact, perhaps with the exception of the Qataris, there is hardly an Arab that is really friendly towards Turkey. And although Turkey has been making several overtures, particularly in recent times, to bridge the gap, and it has had some success because of its economic might, they're not quite friendly. And so Turkey, in order to assert the other identity, which is its Islamic identity or its Muslim identity, has assumed an Islamist platform, and that is the platform of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in that particular endeavor, Turkey has gone out to other parts of the world. And its first target was in the Turkic-speaking nations, particularly in Central Asia, going all the way up to Xinjiang in China. The second thrust was what he thought could be people of Turkic origin or connections in South Asia and Southeast Asia as well. Then he wanted to get into the areas that were, in a sense, new, which was Africa and others. And so you see that he has consistently pushed this Islamist idea and the Muslim Brotherhood in many of his relations. So how does this patch up with the three major powers that you talked about? Because if you look at this particular context that Turkey actually operates in, you see that with the US, a rising middle power does not wish to upset the balance, but it always wants to challenge it. And so you see the kind of pricks and thorns that it comes up with in the NATO relationship, for instance, whether it is for new membership of certain countries, how it seeks to exact concessions, whether it is setting up alliances and partnerships with countries that are opposed to NATO. And let us recall that in the first round of Trump 1.0, there was a certain understanding that Turkey, particularly Erdogan, was able to achieve with Trump, and there was an expectation that that would continue. We are seeing early signs of that, but it is still not fructified quite completely. And so Turkey is not wishing to place all eggs in the same basket. It has a very difficult history with Russia, because the Ottoman Empire had clashed with the Russian Empire. And there are still parts of Eastern Turkey which were under Russian control. And if you go there, you hear the common man talking about the Russians were there across that particular castle or fort. And so that sense has been very strong. But what Erdogan has done is to use this so that he can forge a particular relationship with President Putin and to work on common areas, particularly in terms of the neighborhood. And so you find Russia has been a very useful ally for Turkey in terms of various initiatives immediately south in Syria, Iraq, and some of the issues that they have. Of course, these are also issues on which they have had differences and even strong points of difference. When the Ukraine issue came up, in fact, you pointed out how, on the one hand, they supplied drones to Ukraine, and at the other hand, they actually negotiated a peace deal. And you would recall that particular peace deal that came out in Istanbul in the early days of the war was actually something that both sides, both Russia and Ukraine, had actually accepted. It was another matter that the Europeans did not accept it, and the war has continued for such a long period of time. So Erdogan has had a very interesting relationship with Russia. With China also, you find that the pre-Erdogan era was one in which the Turks, in order to assert their Turkish or Turkic identity, used to have very strong differences with Turkey on the issue of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who are also seen to be having certain Turkic connection. But that was something, although it persisted in the Erdogan era in the early days, that Erdogan has found a certain common ground. So while you find that he continues to be fairly vociferous about Kashmir, which we might come to later, he is not as vociferous about the Uyghur situation in China. And the reason for this is, in his mind, quite simple, because Turkey, as you know, has, while it had remarkable growth and rise as a power, it has somewhat ebbed or slowed down in its pace, and therefore it needs other partners. And China, with its huge muscle, obviously comes out as a very strong partner in this particular exercise. And therefore, it has been using both China and Russia to offset the kind of NATO influence that is diminishing. For instance, Erdogan is very upset that the NATO, although he remains to as a large military force within NATO, that NATO has withdrawn a lot of the heavy equipment from Turkey, and they moved it to Eastern Europe, to the other newly emerged NATO members. And this has been one of the reasons why Erdogan has also sought a certain greater degree of autonomy in the defense space, which we have seen much greater manifestation of. And so it's been a very interesting balance in which I would say his assertions to be a middle power are finding expression in the historical aspect of empire on the one hand, and the representation of an Islamist force on the other. And a lot of the new alliances that Turkey is building are built on these platforms. I can't hear you.
Okay. You very rightly pointed out the geopolitics of all these things. And on one side, if Turkey is trying to balance US, Russia, China, on the other hand, it's trying to have a neo Ottomanism kind of a thing where it's trying to align with the Muslim countries. But there is another thing to it. It is also reaching out to other countries of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So, do you think that is also because of the military and defense industries? Because Turkey is progressing in these areas. And if we see the government the statistics, it says that the defense industry in Turkey, as of now, is valued at nearly $20 billion in its annual production as far as 24-25 is concerned. And with the export alone at about 8 billion. So this is another area where you see that Turkey wants to have markets also, along with its neo-Ottomanism, what it is trying to do with the Muslim countries. It's trying, but it's also trying to see other markets for that. And here I would just like to add, especially with Pakistan, if we see the Turkey relationship with Pakistan. So here I want to ask you, is it transactional or it has this historical connect to it? Because it is not only that China Pak, it is not like the China Pak relation, which is too close. And Pakistan is dependent on China for many areas. But if we try to analyze Pakistan Turkey relationship, so there are hues of it which you can find in this also. For example, I'll just try to show you a slide in which we find that their economic and defense dependencies of Pakistan on Turkey. For example, if we see the Turkish investment in Pakistan, we find it is about 2 billion and 72 projects are going on, which is valued about 3.5 billion. And 420 Pakistani companies are working in Turkey. They have got a preferential trade agreement since 2022. And most importantly, about 130,000 Pakistani tourists visited Turkey in, say, 2024. Now, if you go to the defense sector, can you just, yeah. If you see the defense sector, Turkey exported about $21 million in arms and ammunition. It's trying to build the coverage for them, attack helicopters, Bayraktar drones, loitering munitions, and more importantly, its next generation Khan fighter aircraft, which it is going to co develop with it. So, all these things show that the trade is quite exhaustive. Though it's a peanut compared to its China, but still it's quite substantial. So, in your analysis, both the questions. Firstly, do you feel that Turkey is also looking for economic markets? Secondly, how is the Pakistan Turkey relationship going to progress?
Right. Let me talk about the other countries very briefly before I come to Pakistan for a more detailed look at it. Um, I think Turkey sees itself as a great economic power as well, and it recognizes that in today's world, it needs to have economic engagement with different parts of the world and Africa, Central Asia. I think a lot of that is related to the economic rights and the economic rise of Turkey, and to correct the negative effects that are happening in recent time in the economic front. And so you see that they go ahead, they establish a certain partnership. You have direct flights, you have cultural centers, and you have economic exchanges. So that's the normal route that the Turks adopt, and they do it extremely well. And because it's a very strong and fundamentally very solid economic power, it's able to do that. And it has that diplomatic vision of an old empire. So its initiatives are carried on with purpose in a more deliberate manner. Coming to Pakistan, which I think is something that is of great import to us. Um, I wish to really point out again that, this particular relationship is not something that has happened today. It is something that has been brewing since the 1950s and has been nurtured over time. Let us not forget that India and Pakistan, after independence, both extended recognition and established diplomatic ties with Turkey, and both had extended defense cooperation agreements with Turkey. But Turkey established this defense cooperation agreement with Pakistan in 1955. And there was a certain amount of disquiet on the Indian side because there was no ostensible response to our proposal. The reason why this particular aspect, that is the defense ties, developed with Pakistan was primarily because in the post-war scenario, when Turkey was more closely aligned with the United States, as was Pakistan, there was a certain common ground that came up through the military field. And there was this association of center which brought the two of them together, and it established very deep ties. And some of these ties are enduring and they haven't gone away. So we must not forget that old basis of that relationship. And today, for instance, you will find a certain distinction that is made between the relations with Pakistan and with India, where Pakistan is described as brother, whereas India is described as friend. So there is a certain difference that we should recognize at the outset, which has been there for decades. It's not something that has happened in recent times. But what happened in recent times was that the dilution of the NATO role that Turkey had, while NATO never wanted to divorce itself from Turkey, there was a dilution of the NATO role that Turkey had, while the other EU core European members assumed greater responsibility. Turkey realized that it must work on its defense capabilities itself. And while there was Article 5 and everything, it focused greatly on the development of its defense industry. Now, let's understand that when it switched from the earlier political regime to the AK party of President Erdogan, a lot of the old industry, which was more closely aligned with what now became the opposition, and they've been in opposition for over 2 decades now, they were in a sense marginalized, and new forces were coming up. And the defense industry, S&T industry, were new energy were the ones in which a lot of these developments took place, and the those who were closer to the AK party were the ones who led these particular sectors. Now, the Turks are extremely bright, intelligent people, and they made great advances in terms of the technology for defense. Also, let's not forget that they are very closely plugged in with the NATO system, so they had access to these NATO high quality NATO weaponry and systems, some of which are also used in Pakistan. So that became the driving force for the new industry that was emerging in Turkey. And today, when you find that a lot of its industrial structure is actually in a state of, it's not doing so well, these particular industries that you pointed out so well, the quantum of contribution in GDP as well as in exports is significant and growing. And that becomes a new lever of Turkey's expansion into its diplomatic endeavors overseas. And Pakistan was a very key target. Now, as we know, there was a very deep personal relationship between Nawaz Sharif and Erdogan. They were very, very close at a personal level, and there were, they would exchange visits to the families and so on. These things matter when there is a certain element. Although I would not say that Nawaz Sharif was part of the Islamist agenda, but when there is a factor of religion as well, and this brotherhood thing is being pushed actively, this was something that built that relationship. And let's not forget, when Imran Khan was in
Yes.
the opposition, he actually led a protest against Erdogan's visit. And, he boycotted Erdogan's address in the parliament. But after he became prime minister, he built those bridges very quickly, and he was embraced by Erdogan. So what we do see is that at the leadership levels, there is a great degree of understanding and support. There is a certain ascendance of a certain kind of industry, the defense industry, which is leading the charge in an economy that is otherwise not doing so well. And so these become the normal levers. For instance, if you look at the bilateral trade between Turkey and Pakistan, it was just about $1 billion just a few years ago. And it's even today, it's less than $1.5 billion. But they have set themselves a target of some $5 billion that they wish to,
Yes.
which, for a country of Turkey's size, it's a G20 member, it's a huge economy, is not really all that big. Our bilateral trade, despite our current difficulties, is close to $12 billion. So the trade is not so big. Even when you look at investments, a lot of these are promises. I know, about $2 billion of Turkish investment have been promised in investments in which the Pakistanis are supposed to contribute about $1 billion odd dollars. And while some of these industries have taken off, many of these investments are yet to take off because of the financial difficulties that the Pakistanis themselves are going through. But let us look at what are these sectors where the Turks are coming in. So there is some of these in defense industry, there's renewable energy, and some of the infrastructure sectors. So the relationship is actually now seeking to build stronger bonds. The fact that the Pakistanis have been with the Turks, supported them in many of their Turkish adventures, is something that the Turks have not forgotten. So whether it is in the Armenia-Azerbaijan issue, whether it is in the Cyprus issue, although Pakistan has not recognized Northern Cyprus, or on that issue, or even on some of the other issues regarding Turkey's own neighborhood and some of the internal issues with the Kurds, the Pakistanis have always been extremely supportive. You mentioned a very important thing that is there in this particular relationship, which is about the Pakistani diaspora. The Pakistani diaspora in Turkey is estimated between 70,000 to 100,000 people.
100,000 plus. Yes.
Yeah, and many of them, or most of them, are probably married into Turkish families, and therefore the links have become even deeper. They form a very strong connection between in the kind of business that is done. So there is a fair amount of petty business also that happens, and these people play a very important role in moderating these and in sustaining some of the issues that the Pakistanis are very keen that Turkey keeps alive. For instance, the Kashmir issue, or for instance, the kind of rhetoric that came out after Pahalgam. So it's a deep bond. It has gone on for a very long time. It is not purely transactional. There is one aspect that I think we should not lose track of, and it is also mentioned by Turkish think tanks in some of their reports, and this is the nuclear issue. Now, we don't really know what exactly it is, but this is something that is also mentioned by Turkish think tanks.
Okay, what you rightly pointed out about the diaspora, because I also think the Pakistanis, their favorite spot is Turkey. But now I want to bring you back to India. What do you feel? Does it matter to us if Pakistan has a good relationship with Turkey? So what? Secondly, if you think it matters, then what are the leverages we have? For example, if we consider the trade, as you also rightly pointed out, the Turkish trade with Pakistan may be 1.4 or 1.5, but with India in last few years it was 11.7 billion, nearly 12 billion. So clearly Turkey is a loser here, but it's going beyond that. It's taking the loss and still going beyond. Geopolitically also, if we see, India is deepening its own strategic ties with Turkey's rivals, whether it is Greece, whether it is Cyprus, Armenia, Israel, UAE. So there may be a diplomatic cost for Turkey if it goes to a pro-Pakistan tilt. So what are your views? What should be the future trajectory? Firstly, what should India do and what should be our future trajectory?
I think there are two things that have happened in recent times that are not very uh, palatable. One is Turkey's renewed and continued rhetoric on the Kashmir issue, because it cannot be denied that the Turkish or the Turks are a certain force in the Islamic world, and therefore their interference, so to say, with our community is not acceptable. The second one on which I think we need to understand this, and it is not necessarily something that deserves very strong approbation, is the fact that the defense relations between Turkey and Pakistan have actually grown to such an extent that a lot of that is used against India. Now, of course, we all know that the principal supplier or defense partner of
Drones.
Pakistan is actually China.
Yeah.
And, do we need to take action against them as well? I think the way we deal with Turkey should be in line with our interests. We have our interests, which is primarily to forge ahead on the economic front so that we can become a more prosperous country, so that our citizens have a better standard of living. And with that, and with our other endeavors, will come a certain status in the global stage. I think, broadly speaking, those are two objectives in terms of our diplomatic and our economic diplomacy that we would wish to engage in. So, if we were to look at it in that context, I would say that the Turks can actually be very ideal partners for India on economic collaboration. There are a number of Turkish firms which are in JVs or working in India, contributing across the sector in various services, building of infrastructure. Some of the capacities that the Turkish have in terms of civil engineering are considerable, and they've been engaged in many of our key, including strategic projects in the border areas where the Turks have contributed. Turkish companies have worked very well. And so I think some of those collaborations we should continue, because if it is to our advantage, we should not cut the nose to spite the face. So, I think we should have a more pragmatic approach in line with our interests. There are certain strategic issues on which, for instance, there was a certain collaboration that was proposed at some point of time regarding the building of certain naval supply ships by the Turkish. And that particular contract was cancelled some time back, as you know, the rhetoric had built up. I think on some of those strategic issues, it is natural for India to be much more conservative and careful, and we need to assess this much more deeply. The third issue is about how we can collaborate on some of the regional and geopolitical issues. And I think on that in particular, if we look at some of the geopolitical issues that are happening in terms of peace and security, or in other issues like climate change, or in terms of human rights and others, there are certain points on which we can have commonality of our interests. There can be some mutuality. There is some issue regarding some of these sovereignty issues, and I think the Turks are very insistent on Cyprus, which is something that is not shared by any country in the world, with the exception of Turkey. And there are certain issues regarding Kashmir, which I think we need much more patient discussions. Taking it away from the limelight of media and rhetoric, to have a better appreciation, because it is true that before Erdogan, while they were not aligned with our position, this was not a public position that Turkey would take. So that would be, in a sense, we would be able to reach via media, where we can deal with these issues. So I would say that on broad issues, there is great potential for cooperation and collaboration with Turkey, particularly on economic issues. On strategic issues,
I'll just interpret. I'll just try to ask you one question, simple question. You talk about economic collaboration, but clearly Turkey is not interested in economic collaboration, because if we see, we can provide them a market of 12 billion in compared to Pakistan, which is just 1.4. So clearly their Erdogan's agenda is something else, like neo-Ottomanism and other things. So do you feel that we have to have a little bit of carrot and stick kind of a thing? Because until we work with, we say our enemies are friend. So if we try to work out certain areas at Turkey's backyard and make them realize that we can also trouble you. So do you think that is required? Because if we have a good relationship with Greece, Cyprus, and if we have a corridor where we totally bypass Turkey, it is going to impinge on them. So what are your views?
I would say a lot of the economic interaction that happens between India and Turkey is not really through the AK party or Erdogan. It happens with the private sector, much of which is not necessarily a supporter of Erdogan. So I think the economic interaction is of a different nature. And by doing that, we are neither supporting nor working against Turkey. We are, supporting our interest and getting good products, good technologies, building our infrastructure with companies that are world class. And they've got nothing to do with Erdogan. So I think we need to recognize that. If we do our homework, and I think people know about all this, many of the partners that we have on the economic side are not necessarily our party people. So I would wish to put that on record. Regarding the other thing which you said, that's very important. I think at certain times you do need other levers. So the kind of relations that we have built with Armenia or with Greece or with Cyprus are not only something that has happened in recent times. They're actually age old. They've been there for a very long period of time, but they've been stepped up in a way to signal. And I must also mention that the Turks have taken note of this, and they are extremely offended about it. And I think that is the objective, because it should not be so obvious to them that they can do things to us without us doing things back to them, particularly if these are things that we do not like. So I'm happy that our activities in Turkish neighborhood has had its desired effect, because Turkish scholars and Turkish analysts have taken note of India's activities in its neighborhood. We've recently seen a certain rapprochement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Azerbaijan has become a very vocal opponent of many of the things that India does, because Azerbaijan, as you know, is very closely aligned to Turkey. If you go
Pakistan.
to the
Right.
OIC, where there is a contact group on Kashmir, the two fundamental members of that who raise the voice most actively are Turkey and Azerbaijan. There is Niger and Saudi Arabia, of course, but they don't speak up as much as the Turks and the Azeris do. So I think it is very important that we work on Turkey's neighborhood, uh, and it will be from our self-interest. I don't think we have to tell the Turks we're doing this because you're doing something to us, but it will have a certain desired effect on that as well. But we should always do this as well from our self-interest perspective.
Uh, Ambassador, I have wanted to ask you another question since you was the ambassador in Turkey. So, how was the Turkey's relationship with our diaspora? What do you
With
think
our
about it?
diaspora,
Indian diaspora there.
right?
How did they react to the Indians there?
Right. As you know, the Indian diaspora in Turkey is actually very small. We have a very significant amount of investments in Turkey, apart from the trade that we do. We are engaged in a range of activities, ranging from, Mahindra owns their largest tractor and, farming equipment company in Turkey is owned by an Indian company. We have very large chemical plants over there. We have very large presence of Tata Steel, for instance. A lot of it comes from Tata operations around in that neighborhood. So our investments in Turkey are quite considerable. Um, but the Indian community in Turkey is relatively small. So we do have a small pocket of business community people who work with these companies who are based in certain parts of India, of Turkey, and they generally have very good and amiable relations with the Turkish people. I must also mention that the Turkish people actually are very friendly towards India and Indians. I think the sentiment that we see from certain elements of the ruling party in Turkey are not shared by all members of the ruling party either. And at a popular level, there is great attachment and affection for India. The other community of Indians of the diaspora that we have in Turkey is a large community of students, and they are spread in universities across the country. And as I mentioned earlier, their education system is also of very good quality, and so many of these people end up in opportunities either in Turkey or they go to Europe subsequently, and are highly regarded for their academic qualities, their independence in thought. And the Turks are actually a set of people who like excellence and strive for it, professionalism and integrity. And I think the Indians who are there in Turkey do exhibit it. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very small community and nothing compared in terms of size to the Pakistanis.
Uh, Ambassador Bhattacharya, can we take few questions now?
Yes, certainly. If you will just repeat the question, I would be very
Yes,
happy to
I'll
take.
just. We'll take some questions now. Yeah, this is by Mr. Akash Thadani. He said Bharat is linking up with nations in the Mediterranean in general and France, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus in particular. Have our enemies considered this change in geopolitics? We were talking about it, so if you want to elaborate more, you can.
Yes. When the IMEC was announced, one of the
Yes.
first countries to voice opposition was Turkey, because historically Turkey has seen itself, through Constantinople, now Istanbul, as the corridor to Europe. And even if you look at some of the Chinese BRI initiatives that Turkey has become part of, the Middle Corridor of the Silk Road project. So Turkey, sees itself as one of those champions of guiding transit through to Europe. So it was very, very offended. But I think there's a deeper issue in this. the Eastern Mediterranean in particular has become extremely volatile because of a number of reasons. One of those is the discovery of hydrocarbons and the disputed nature of that, and that has added to some of the older issues that were there between the Turks and the Greeks. But the Turks and the Greek issue, although there is a high degree of animosity at a certain level, has never really gone into conflagration or into conflict situations. So, it's like a managed antagonism. So, in a sense, IMEC is in a bind today with the condition that we see in West Asia. The continuance of war in West Asia has been a huge setback to IMEC, and although we are trying to make preparations to go ahead, it has not followed the trajectory that we would have wished it to. But the Turks are not happy. But IMEC itself is going to be expanding, I would expect. We would
Yes.
probably have more nodes that would come up. And if the Turks behave well and, we can have a working relation, why not have another node in Turkey? Just as, we've extended the node from Italy to Greece to France. And so we can have another node in Turkey, and they can have a vested interest in this as well.
Otherwise, we can also bypass Turkey, go through Cyprus and go. That's also.
We have no need for Turkey in this particular project,
Yes,
but the
absolutely.
Turks see merit because nobody is an enemy forever, and I do believe that the Turks, at the end of the day, will become friends. It'll be in their interest to be friends of India rather than of Pakistan. I think
That is
that
important.
realization will come, and so we should not rule out that option of having the Turks on board for one of our projects. It's in our interest to do this kind of exchange. So if the Turks wish to come on board as a friend, they would be most welcome.
Yes, if they take a step forward, we'll definitely try to reciprocate. I mean, I'm sure about it. But as of now, the things are thought, so it'll take
No, no,
time.
no. Today, I think it's not a possibility that we can discuss.
Yeah. Any other question? One last question can we take? Aishwarya, she's asking, how do you view the Pak-Azerbaijan-Turkey alignment? Do you think Turkey values economics over alignment, and can India find leverage through that?
Yeah, the Azeris have become so close to the Turks that a lot of their autonomy in policy, whether it is domestic, energy, or foreign policy, is in a sense guided by the Turks. And there was a point of time, as we all know, where when our relations with the Azeris were actually much better. We used to have a lot of exchanges, including of trade with them. It's also a very critical link in the north-south corridor that we
Yes.
wish to achieve through Chabahar and go up past Iran. So I think there is a role for Azeris, and I think today, in the heat of the moment, and guided by the leadership in Turkey, they are probably seeing another perspective. But I think with the coming of peace in that region, and I hope it holds. I'm not sure it will,
Yes.
but I
Yes.
hope it holds. There will be a new paradigm in which the Azeris don't need to be opposed to India. They're doing it only for political reasons, and they're losing out economically because of that. So I think that can be a crucial thing, and I expect that the Iranians, if they can find via media, the peace settlement has not found full understanding in Iran, as you know. But if there can be certain developments in that, and that region can then become something in which all of us can get engaged, and the kind of interdependence that the Azeris will have with Iran and with India, once that improves, will provide an entirely different scenario.
I fully agree, and I think Armenians will be very happy because they don't have those connectivity. They are banking on the connectivities, and Azerbaijan and Armenia, if they really work out together economically both of them will be benefiting, and also our thing will also smoothen out. So that's quite true. And I think uh, since Iran had also gone, representatives from Iran had also gone there. So it's early to say, but something is happening there. So I hope it turns out positive. There's one more question. Is Turkey covertly trying to append the IMSC project, IMEC project? They are very unhappy about it, like you said.
Yeah, my sense
This
on
is by
this is
lunchtime.
that once we have a better situation in West Asia, we really need this war to come to an end. This is not the time for war, as Prime Minister had said, and we want our friends in Israel and Palestine to come together on this particular issue. And I hope that there is peace. Once there is peace, I think the natural logic of this, which has been, these three nodes, which will then connect up India to West Asia and onwards towards Europe, will become a reality. And there, of course, is possibilities of expansion in which we can have further integration of Egypt in particular, that has already been now mentioned. We will see greater synergies happening. So I don't think the Turks have any role in IMEC at present. They can neither help it nor prevent it. But I would remain optimistic that the Turks will become friendly in the days to come, and we will not need to have an adversarial relation with Turkey,
Relationship.
because it is a great civilization and it's a great economy. We work on the G20 with the Turks and on certain other forum as well. And I hope that this can be extended to the bilateral context.
Yes. There's one more question. The Turkish fondness for Pak, driven by Erdogan for various reasons, seems quite solid, and cooperation is very deep embedded. Can we actually tilt Turkey in our favor? We have already spoken about this, so I'll just try to take some other this thing. There's Is Turkey growing close to China? How will they manage this given the US is back with Turkey?
Yes, I would say in some ways Turkey is growing closer to China. The hands-off approach that the Turks earlier had, particularly because of political and human rights issues, are now at a lower ebb. It is increasingly embedded in the BRI. There are a number of projects that the Turks are engaged in. There was a very active debate in Turkey about whether they should or should not get into BRI. But once they decided that they would, I think they have gone ahead in typical Turkish manner of doing that. But I think what this also does for Erdogan is provide another front where they can play off the Western alliance, with whom they're actually in alliance, but they can use that as leverage, and it's obviously useful for the Chinese as well. It goes back to this idea of Erdogan of being that middle power and having greater space and the ability to exert that greater space. And so a lot of Russia, China that is happening is in that context.
I agree with you, and I think China, like most of the other nations, is the largest trading partner for Turkey. So that shows that economically they have grown a lot. And also, as far as Turkey is trying to balance its relationship with NATO and other countries, also, in fact, NATO also requires Turkey because the Turkish Strait, which it controls, and that is NATO's eastern and southern flanks. So there's a lot of geopolitics which is getting involved. But I would really like to thank you for taking so many questions and so beautifully explaining the geopolitics, what is happening and what we need to do. We have to wait and see how it goes. And I'm sure things will change, because geopolitics is one thing which you can never say that this is going to happen. It's very dynamic and it keeps changing all the time. So, your any last word? before we close?
Thank you, Roshan. This has really been a very lovely experience to come back to Claus and have this exchange with you and your participants on the forum. Turkey for us is a very important partner. We are going through a difficult phase, and I think this recognition is there on both sides. Both India and Turkey recognize we are going through a difficult phase. I want to reassure all my friends here that not everyone in Turkey believes they should have an adversarial relation with India. And there are many who would actually wish otherwise. And so we can find a balance in which our interests and our objectives can be served by a positive engagement with Turkey. It does not have to be all negative. But if Turkey were not to mend itself, we have levers, and you described some of them yourself. But I think Turkey will choose the better option in the days to come. And leadership often decides these things, and Turkish leadership will also change, as will its particular sentiment.
And as you mentioned, Turkish are intelligent people. So let's hope for the best. And thank you so much for this podcast. And I
Thanks.
thank all the viewers for this, asking questions. Thank you.